All right, we're ready. Here we go again with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee, and of course, got another friend, colleague, Jacqueline Battalora. Jackie, we've been having these to really help people get familiar with the folks who've been a part of the White Privilege Conference. A lot of people see you on the main stage, they see you do workshops, but we want people to know who the people are. So that's really what Coffee with the Founder has been designed to do. So can we start by you just introducing yourself? If I was to meet you at the grocery store or at the airport and I say, who are you? What do you do? How would you answer that?
Well, my name's Jacqueline Battalora, and I'm a scholar, a lecturer, and I hope that my work advances racial justice. My particular academic area of focus is on whiteness studies, and I am most interested in exploring ways in which whiteness was invented and then how it gets recreated and recreated and recreated in each moment of U.S. history.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about whiteness and its manifestation, recreation, particularly as it relates to today. But before that, I was going to ask you if you had to define that term or explain that term to the average person, first year student maybe, just coming to one of your classes. Sure. How do you explain or define whiteness?
Yeah, okay, that's a course, I'm just saying. So here we go. Here's the best I can do. It's not easy to do just verbally, but I'm gonna do my best to do so. And I'll use at least one concrete example that I hope will flesh it out. So let me just start with the just general definition of whiteness. And here I draw from the work of one of the founding mothers of whiteness studies, and that's Ruth Frankenberg. She was a sociologist, I believe at UC Davis, and she wrote this terrific book called White Women, Race Matters. And in this book, she articulates, I think, a really useful explanation of whiteness. And she says that whiteness has three components to it. The first is structural advantage, and I'll come back and give you an example of it, but just hold on to that. So sort of column one of whiteness is structural advantage. Column two is the way in which that structural advantage shaped the ways in which white people see themselves, view others, and view the world. So that's column two of whiteness. And then column three is the ways in which those two interacted or are interacting now to shape a social norm, a cultural norm. And so let me make that concrete. And I'll use my favorite historical example. We know that the founders of this nation, when they met for the very first time, the very first Congress, they determined that in order to naturalize a US citizen, one had to be white. So that law of 1790, which, by the way, the requirement of being white lasted 150 years. So that created a structural advantage for immigrants seen as white. They got access to citizenship, something that all others who were not seen as white didn't get, which gave you, of course, access to a political voice, access to jobs, etc. So structural example. So the second component is then how did that structural advantage, access to citizenship for whites only, shape ways in which white people viewed themselves, others, or the world? And I think it shaped white people to view the world, their world of the United States, as one that was for white people. This nation was for white people. And then the third column is a cultural norm. And the cultural norm that those worked together in dynamic exchange to create is this presumption that white equals American. And we still preserve that cultural norm today. For example, some of you are African American, some are Latinx American, some are Indigenous American, some are Asian American, Pacific Island American. But even if I arrived in this nation and spoke English last week, I would just be seen as American. And so linguistically, we preserve that white equals American equation that was created way back in the first decades of this nation. And so that's those dynamic exchanges of structural advantage, shaping white people's viewpoints, shaping cultural norms, those are in dynamic. They're not clean columns, of course. They're interacting and shaping the next generation of whiteness. And so that, I find that, and here's maybe another way to understand whiteness as a matter of description. It is these dynamic processes and interactions that persistently position white people above persons of color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful, and thank you for that. And I think about a person hearing that, and I wonder. I imagine their next question being, but what does that look like today, right? That's some real good historical knowledge. I mean, right now we're in the midst of this pandemic. We're hearing things about the reports of disparities in reference to how different communities are being hit by this. I mean, when you look at it from the lens of your work and research, is there a way that you can talk about how this whiteness is just playing out just right now in our society?
Absolutely, Eddie. And thank you for that question, bringing it up to today. So the real response to your question is, where is it not performing? Because it has shaped our normative thinking. Virtually every law crafted in this nation, every policy created at hospitals, in governments, and the like, in schools, has been crafted from the position of white people. So with their interests and perspective as central. And so when that's the case, what you have is policies and practices that allow white people to thrive, allow white people to advance and to live, in this case, literally to live. How are we evaluating among terrible choices in the healthcare system right now, who lives and who doesn't? And when we look at the healthcare vulnerabilities that whiteness has played a fundamental role in creating, and what I mean by that is, remember, it's not just age that's showing to make one particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, but rather various underlying, especially respiratory and cardiac, heart-related conditions. And so, well, let's look at that. What communities are exposed to environmental conditions and to a lack of healthcare choices that render them more statistically more likely to be in those positions of having underlying conditions? Look at rates of asthma among children of African American descent. So the whole structure, the whole setup of the game, think of the creation of this country as like a game of Monopoly, a Monopoly board. And so it was set up by a group of people, economically advantaged white men, Protestant white men. And so it is out of their perspective and their interests and their view of the world that this game board is established. And so white women got access to those set of privileges on the game board of Monopoly through marriage to those white men. And then we the nation largely excluded various groups of people seen as not white, and certainly enslaved persons of African descent. So imagine I got to go around that game board many, many times before you, Eddie, got to join in. Who's going to win the game? Right? It doesn't take, you don't have to be Einstein to answer the question. So just because access was allowed at a certain point doesn't mean the original setup doesn't continue to harm indigenous communities whose property, they never thought of it in that way. That's a very European perspective, whose resources and environment was taken, whose people were decimated by the arrival of Europeans, the colonization by Europeans. And so just because access has been granted doesn't mean that original structure isn't continuing to manifest inequality rooted in whiteness. And we are seeing it play out. Look at the rates of death among persons of particularly African-American and indigenous descent. Why is that happening? What whiteness will do is that it will shape a narrative, as it has in the past, of blaming them. It's Black people's fault. It's indigenous people's fault. It's almost comical, if it were not tragic, the ways in which whiteness, usually articulated through people seen as white, has worked to blame various communities for harms they've experienced, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's death by various illnesses, whether it's poverty, you name it, we've got an excuse for it that blames Black people, never whiteness.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking that it seems like there are these moments in our country where people, white people specifically, have a belief things are getting better post-racial Obama, and then bam, now we have the leadership we have in the government. Primarily though, I think having white supremacists and hate groups, somewhat begin to feel emboldened, empowered. So it's like a wake-up call, right? So maybe we're not post-racial. So I'm wondering, what do you think the results of COVID-19 and its devastating impact on people of color, primarily Black folks, but people of color in general, in such a disproportionate way, what is that saying about America, where we are right now? And I look at that and I feel pain, I feel anger. I'm wondering what happens for a white person when they see these results? Should I be more concerned that more of them are feeling guilty, or should I be concerned more of them are feeling supreme, happy that they're white?
Right. Well, of course, white people are diverse, right? And the range of responses that whiteness produces are there is still a range even within whiteness, right? So you have a version of a response, which is what's wrong with them, right? Because the way of thinking that whiteness has produced in this nation by virtue of our laws, policies, and practices is a thinking that keeps white people as the ones who matter the most, and has taught us to find something wrong, right? We had to find something wrong with indigenous people to justify the taking of their land and their annihilation. We had to justify something being wrong with persons of African descent. Otherwise, good Christians couldn't be enslaving them, right? So that practice of blaming is deep. It's deep. It is in the soil of European colonization in this country. So the array of responses out of whiteness on the part of white people includes blaming people of color. It includes being grateful for white superiority, right? Because it seems that white people have some superior physicality if white people in these numbers are being so significantly less harmed and impacted. And truthfully, Eddie, I'm sure there's 1,000 other locations that whiteness, of responses that whiteness produces. But let's be clear, none of them are truthful, because fundamentally whiteness produces lies. It fundamentally produces lies, because there is nothing wrong with African Americans. There is nothing wrong with indigenous people. What's wrong is the structures of whiteness that persistently harm and push those communities to the margins.
Yeah. Now, you made a very important point about the vast number of white people and diversity that in stages that folks can be in, and particularly when it relates to whiteness. So I definitely got to keep holding that in my head, not to get too blanketed, even though I feel like, you know, I'm experiencing a kind of terror associated with being Black, being male.
You are.
It has nothing to do with, you know, who I am, but some of these stereotypical portrayals. But that aside, what I wanted to ask you is, if you have white people listening now, you know, people on board or people in your circle saying, Jackie, what can I do? What are some steps I can be taking during this time as we're watching what we're watching? What are you advising or saying to people who you know will listen?
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Eddie. What I would encourage people to do, well, look, it's always a long answer, I'm sorry, but here we go. So we have to, in order to challenge whiteness, we have to develop, and the best way I know to name what it is whiteness competency. We have to develop a competency in understanding whiteness, how it works, so that we can name it all around us, including inside of us. And so in order to have this competency, we have to not only know how whiteness has been constructed and reconstructed at different points. You don't have to know all US history, that's not required, but you do have to know enough. And there's no absolute on how we get to enough. I imagine it's perhaps somewhat unique for each person. So we have to learn about how being white has been used to advantage white people, whether poor, female, facing disabilities, LGBT, even in interaction with these other subjugated statuses. Whiteness means something that a person gets privilege and advantage from. Take that law of 1790, the naturalization law. Even persons with these other challenges in life and social statuses that confer greater difficulty in US society, but being white still got one access to naturalization. So we can't lose, we both want to hold on to the ways in which real people's bodies experience whiteness, and the fact that there's always something that whiteness confers that all people get. So we have to learn something about those. Also, the other part of whiteness competency that is so critical is we have to know something about communities of persons of African, Indigenous, Asian, and Pacific Island and Latinx descent. We have to understand something of these different communities. Oftentimes it is in the difference. It's sort of like good anthropology, right? Oftentimes we can't see our own unusualness within our own religion or within our own normative culture until we go visit another one. And so visiting another or studying or experiencing another religion, and I say religion because in my experience with undergraduate students, that's a really powerful one, for being able to come back and view their own religion in a particular way, seeing it as having, what they're expecting me to believe, what, to ask questions of that for the first time. And so the same is true for developing this competency that we need to have. And that is, if I'm trapped at home, quarantined, or otherwise encouraged to sit still, there are so many things that one could be doing to develop this competency. We could learn some of the histories of indigenous people and a truthful version of what happened when the Spanish and then British and Dutch and others came to colonize the continent of North America. We can learn about African traditions and African American histories that, again, are not part of the US curriculum. And all of the variety of ways in which communities excluded from whiteness have persevered, even in the face of the barriers that whiteness has put up for them. So taking this opportunity to learn, and I know, Eddie, that you keep a stack of books that you recommend for people. Start digging into those books. Ebooks are available online. And I'm pretty sure it was Barnes and Noble and Amazon who hired more people to deal with all of the books being ordered, because people are trapped at home. So use it to read and learn. There's also lots of documentaries that are particularly good right now. If you haven't seen When They See Us, about the Central Park Five, our friend Youssef, his story, watch it, learn, understand. And I would particularly encourage people to dig into these resources with an intentional effort to intentionally understand the workings of whiteness. How did whiteness work to cause the Central Park Five to be treated as they were, to be viewed as they were? How did the system reflect, the legal system reflect whiteness? How did the system of the media reflect whiteness to allow that to play out as it did?
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about two additional things, more specific about what to do now to people who are willing to do things. One is white women. So we'll come to that one second. But the first one is your parent hat. How do you talk to young people, your kid, about whiteness on display now, where it feels to me that there is a great reward to side with whiteness? And so if someone's listening and wondering how to talk to particularly a white kid about what's happening now, what are some of your thoughts, suggestions, or tips in reference to talking to young people?
Yeah. Well, of course, it depends on the age. Super young, let's say 5-ish years old, I would recommend any number of picture books that provide the historical foundation to talk in appropriate bits about what's happening today. And I'll give you my favorite one. And it's called, I believe, before we leave, we could take a little blip and I can run and grab it. Ruth and the Green Book. And it's a picture book that tells the story of a Chicago family of African descent in the 50s, heading down to Alabama to visit grandma, driving. And of course, after they pass the Mason-Dixon line, go across the Mississippi, their car breaks down, and the mechanic, who is white, will not service them. They cannot find a hotel. they can't find a place to eat. And so all of these challenges, and you find that the Green Book, which of course many of us became familiar with, if you didn't know that history, because of the award-winning film about was it called The Green Book, I think? And so this Green Book was published, I believed, by an African-American man. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, from New York, who was a salesman at the time. And it's the only way he could perform his work, was to have these resources, knowing where I can get gas, where I can get food. So this story of Ruth and the Green Book I found it a terrific way to introduce my young daughter, when she was 5, to this history. And of course, she asked things like they used the word Negro, and I just explained to her that was a terminology to reference a person who was of African, whose relatives were from Africa, right? So there were little words that we had to talk about, but nothing terribly challenging. She got it. I said, just like your relatives are from Italy, Ruth's relatives some of them were from Africa. And so and of course, one of the first things that my young daughter asked was, well, why would white people think that? Why would they treat this family in a way that was so mean? And then to articulate that many white people were taught, even at church on Sunday, through their government and through their local community, that they were better than people who were not seen as white. And, her eyes got so big, and she just thought that was crazy. and then, so that book I found a powerful resource for introducing a very young child to a truthful history in a way that was really manageable. And we have gone back to that book, to referencing that history and of white supremacy. I didn't really use that language at the time, but white people believed they were better than, was the language I used. And so we go back to it. We continue to talk about it as the current manifestation of that same dynamic. We're seeing it in our midst. And so now, as she's a teenager, we can talk about it with ease, because from a very young age, she learned that was a reality. I also found that particular book really helpful, because the one thing she did get in the public school system was a celebration of Dr. King Day, right? But they didn't understand really the context that Dr. King and other civil rights leaders were challenging, except in a very kind of whitewashed sort of way. And so that book really was helpful for bringing just a more solid understanding. So for young people, there are some terrific picture books.
I want to just have you talk a little bit about white women, and we can have more time, maybe add some more about some possible young adult readers or learners, if you got some additional things. And I'm careful about this white women question, because I hear it in so many ways and applied in different ways. For example, with the election and how they participated, all those kinds of things. But what I'm essentially asking you, and this is a sweeping question, but I'm wondering, in your experience, what's the state of white women today when it comes to social justice, racial justice, understanding these kinds of terms and white supremacy, whiteness, and really truly beginning to create the kind of society that's more equitable, so on and so forth. That's the way I'm really framing this question, because I'm just wondering about the bigger picture as opposed to one moment or one person.
Right.
Because it seems like white women have participated different ways over time in really getting our society to where we are today. But as we look at the next 25 years, what's your sense of the role of white women and some of the challenges and opportunities ahead of us as we grapple with some of the complex issues of white supremacy, whiteness, COVID-19, disparities across education, across income, so on and so forth.
Well, I don't want to be a downer, but in my experience of conducting trainings and working with teachers and lawyers, helping to raise awareness of whiteness, here's what I see. The hopeful piece is that there is definitely an advancement in understanding, right? It's starting to grow. And maybe that's a seed that will start to see some fruit from that. But I don't see it. I do not see it. What's happening is we seem to have these moments of white women in particular grasping an insight, making a connection, being emotionally tapped by the cruelty and the harm of whiteness being enacted through our schools, our treatment of children of color, and then it disintegrates. That empathy that was created, that understanding seems to not be amplified enough or held on to enough or be big enough to be sustained. And so it's very discouraging, as you know, to see that. And the one piece of hope I have, and I can connect it to my own experience. I remember sometimes in undergrad, some of my professors would say something that, and I can actually give a concrete example. I had a couple professors who really would talk about being still. Eddie, I didn't know what the hell that meant. I mean, of course, in the most literal of way, just stopping physically, but I like being present. Actually, that's it, being present. No clue. I really didn't understand it until having a child. No clue whatsoever. But the seed of that was in me, and so eventually I was able to connect. But it took a long time. And my hope is that the seeds that you are planting through the White Privilege Conference, and I hope that my lectures and my research and my writing are part of that, that those seeds will eventually lead to something amplified, something sustained, something that can be held on to, that the empathy, I think is huge. You've heard me speak many times, Eddie, and I talk about the fact, the moment, because I totally remember in vivid detail, the moment when I realized that my empathy toward people of color that I didn't know, strangers, was virtually non-existent. And I realized that what did that to me is whiteness. And I know it's possible to get that back, but at least in my experience and that of many white women who engage in this work reveals, is that it takes intentionality, it takes a commitment, and it takes work. And I will offer a little incentive. Well, I hope it's big incentive to white people in particular who are watching this. What also has become very clear to me in studying whiteness is the realization that of the harm that it causes white people. It's not as obvious in death rates, in denied access to healthcare, and the ways that we see it play out on communities of color. But just because it doesn't play out the same doesn't mean the harm isn't there. And the harm is to the fundamental components of our humanity. Because if you think about sort of psychology 101 and how we understand a healthy a healthy person psychologically, emotionally, and having empathy is a fundamental piece of that. And we can see nationally, hell, globally, we can see that powerful white forces are acting in ways that diminish and harm and kill communities of color. And we are doing that. We're doing it. The fact that we're doing it is evidence of lost humanity. To not see people as fully human unless they're white, we're enacting it all the time. We're enacting it in our local communities when we have usually white teachers who experience excited behavior by young African American boys and girls in their classrooms as aggressive, and the same behavior by white children as energetic. And we're playing a role in that school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like we could have a whole show on that topic.
For sure.
But that's really helpful, insightful, and particularly talking to people who we know want to do better. I mean, it's so hard to talk to the most resistant. In fact, I'm not spending my time on the most resistant anymore.
Right.
And I know that your work, your research has played a tremendous role in really providing some information, some knowledge around particularly the creation of white people, whiteness, and its, especially here in the US, but globally, its impact on society. What I just find amazing is how we're watching it being playing out today. And I'm just wondering what this time is going to do for the future of our nation. So as you look ahead, what are some things you're working on, you're thinking about as you look at the next 10 years, 15 years of your life, your work? What's on the horizon for you?
Well, you know what? One of the things, and I have to say, Eddie, I had the opportunity to learn this largely through opportunities that you've given me to participate in white privilege symposiums as a speaker, and that through those presentations, I've learned from participants that talking about the very personal part of my own learnings through whiteness, like the history is helpful, but then connecting it in a very personal way with recognizing a loss of my humanity and then scraping and grabbing to get that back and to be able to experience empathy for people regardless of one's racial category, that is powerful. And so I've really been using that in my presentations, and now I've begun to really articulate it in written form. And so I hope to have a book coming out in the not too distant future. It will be called Becoming Human. I also have a second edition that Routledge is publishing of Birth of a White Nation. And it has, and let me share this, like it has new features to it that were part of my learning, right? Because I first wrote the book and you would think there were no indigenous people in North America, right? Because I completely just started with, when the white people got here, who weren't white, of course, yet. And so, part of my own learning is reflected in the second edition of the importance of recognizing people. And so I'll share some of my own blinders and my own growth are even reflected in the historical work in a second edition. So that's a piece, like really recognizing the personal has a power with white women in particular that I'm hoping to tap into more. I'm hope maybe that's a way, Eddie, for at least some of the insights from my whiteness work to have a greater impact. Some of the things that I've learned, and I meant to get to this, but I took so darn long to say what I said, with regard to giving advice to white women who are willing to do the work. And I can share a few things that I do, I still do, and I am when you get to a place where you have a degree of something that we could call whiteness competency, here are some things that you manifest. You know that you don't know. You know that you don't know a whole lot, especially about the perspective, interests, and concerns of communities of color. So there is a humility that you enter the world with that is wonderful. It's wonderful to have that. Secondarily, you have a suspicion. You begin with the place that racism is being enacted here. You begin there. Why? Because the vast majority of the history suggests that you are on solid ground to start from there. You may find that that's not the case, but I promise you it will be the rare exception. So we begin inquiries in our workplace, in our schools, in our homes, in our communities, and in ourselves, that racial bias in negative ways directed toward communities of color is happening. Start there. And when you know that's a place to begin, and that whiteness causes that, pushes us in that direction, the defenses don't have to go up, and you can really sit with it in a way that's honest. You can meditate over it, allowing those defenses to melt away, and it will allow a healing of our humanity, and give us the sense of self that we need to be active in the world in anti-racist ways.
Yeah, I like the fact that that's part of what you'll continue to do. I mean, it's nice to have you continue to expand your work and research, but most importantly, to hear you talk about that part of what you're going to be doing is your work.
Absolutely.
And,
it never ends.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that and some details around that. We want to end in a fun way, a light way, so to speak. And that's with, what are you watching? What have you watched that has taught you some things over these quarantine days? And what have you watched that just kind of takes you away? Any suggestions, streaming suggestions that you would give? We're kind of creating a little database just to give folks not only some knowledge from our conversations, but also maybe some things to, kind of chill out with, because we need that time as well.
Yeah. Oh, you're going to make me remember a label of something that I'm totally going to fail. This is the test I fail, Eddie. Well, okay. So one of the last things that I remember I don't watch a lot of TV, even in this. See, here's what you have to understand, is that I'm a professor at a university. My work has increased, not decreased at home.
Yes.
It has increased. Yeah. And so until graduation, which will be something online, of course, I'm swamped. I'm absolutely swamped. So I'm looking forward to seeing your list that you're putting together. Yeah. I'm probably not the best person to contribute to it, since I go to bed exhausted at late hours in the night. But let me tell you a couple things I have watched, and I'm not going to remember the darn name. Oh, Let Them Burn, the documentary. I mean, I love historical stuff.
Yeah.
And so Let Them Burn. It's this terrible story of an incident in Philadelphia. And the title of it comes from what the officers and firefighters said, let them burn. I'm not going to tell you anymore. Watch it. I hope to intrigue you enough.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That is, see, there you go. Even though I had to squeeze you a little bit, you gave me a a beautiful gem to hold on
nugget.
to. So we'll take that.
Yeah.
Jacqueline Battalora, we appreciate you joining us. I appreciate you always supporting me and my work, and looking forward to continuing to be in collaboration and partnership with you. Be safe and take care.
You too. Love you, Eddie. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be with you and part of the White Privilege Conference family. And I owe so much of my own growth to you, and you're always keeping me, nudging me along, and I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Peace and love. Take care.